Imagine waking up in ancient Rome and realizing before your feet even touch the floor that the universe is already paying attention to you, not in a comforting guardian angel way, more like a clipboard and frown way. This is not a world where gods live far away on distant mountains, occasionally peeking in for drama. This is a world where gods are present, actively, constantly, and comfortably. Before we step into the uneasy daily lives of ancient Rome, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this. Now, let's begin. To be an ordinary Roman was to live inside a surveillance state run by immortals with strong opinions and very little patience. The gods were not abstract ideas or philosophical concepts reserved for poets and priests. They were assumed to be everywhere, in the street, in the market, in your home, in the doorway between your home and the street, in the moment you stepped over that doorway, and possibly judging how you stepped. Modern people often imagine ancient religion as loud festivals and grand temples, but for the average Roman, religion was quiet, constant, and exhausting. It wasn't about belief so much as awareness. You didn't ask whether the gods existed. That question wouldn't even make sense. The question was whether you were currently annoying one of them without realizing it. There was no such thing as neutral space, no religious off switch. You couldn't step outside the system because the system was the air. Every action existed in a universe thick with divine presence. Walking, eating, speaking, working, resting, none of it happened in a vacuum. Everything happened in front of someone. Someone immortal, someone powerful, someone who had ruined cities for less. And the unsettling part wasn't that the gods watched. It was that they watched silently. There was no flashing warning sign when you messed up. No divine cough. No polite reminder. Just the lingering possibility that somewhere, somehow, something had gone wrong. And you wouldn't know until later, when the consequences arrived like an invoice you didn't remember signing. This created a particular psychological atmosphere. Low-level dread all the time. Not panic, not terror. Just the constant awareness that your daily life carried invisible weight. Every small action felt like it mattered more than it should. Not because you were important, but because you were exposed. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply didn't exist. You might be physically alone, but spiritually? Absolutely not. Solitude was never empty. It was crowded with unseen attention. The gods didn't need temples to see you. Temples were for you, so you knew where to go apologize. And this shaped how Romans thought about themselves. You were not an individual moving freely through the world. You were a participant in a cosmic system that noticed everything and forgave very little. You were always on stage, even when you didn't know the script. The unsettling humour of it is that nothing about this system required you to be evil to get into trouble. You didn't need to commit crimes or betray anyone. You could offend the universe by being slightly careless, slightly distracted, or slightly unlucky. The gods weren't hunting villains. They were monitoring behaviour, and behaviour is hard to get perfect when the rules are invisible. This constant sense of being watched created a culture obsessed with correctness. Not morality, correctness. Doing things the right way in the right order, at the right time, with the right words. Mistakes weren't just mistakes. They were risks. And ignorance was not a defence. If anything, it was more dangerous. You could offend a god simply because you didn't know you were supposed to acknowledge them in the first place. So daily life developed a strange tension. On the surface, Rome was loud, crowded, busy and energetic. Beneath that noise there was an undercurrent of caution, a sense that life wasn't just happening, it was being evaluated. People didn't relax fully because relaxation implied forgetting, and forgetting implied risk. And yet, this wasn't experienced as cruelty, it was normal. This was the emotional weather of Roman life. You grew up inside it. Children learned early that the world wasn't empty, that actions echoed beyond what you could see. Fear wasn't a dramatic emotion, it was background noise, like traffic, like wind. The irony is that this constant divine presence didn't make people feel special. It made them feel small, watched, but not cherished, observed, but not guided. The gods weren't there to help you express yourself or find inner peace. They were there to maintain order. Cosmic order, social order, behavioral order. So you lived carefully, not heroically, carefully. You tried to move through the day without drawing attention, without causing offense, without accidentally stepping on something sacred you didn't know was sacred until it was too late. The good news, you were never alone in ancient Rome. The bad news, neither was your clumsiness, your forgetfulness, or that one thing you did without thinking. And the gods, they noticed. If living in ancient Rome felt like being watched, this is where you learned why. The gods weren't just everywhere in a vague cosmic sense. They were specific, painfully specific. The Roman world wasn't governed by a small council of powerful deities overseeing big ideas like love, war, and fate. It was governed by an overwhelming crowd of minor divine specialists, each responsible for a tiny slice of existence and each perfectly capable of taking offense. Modern people divide life into sacred and ordinary. Romans didn't have that luxury. Their ordinary life was sacred, which meant every routine action came with spiritual implications. You didn't simply walk through a doorway. You crossed a threshold that mattered. You didn't just close a door, you interacted with a structure that had divine oversight. You didn't just pour something down a drain. You involved forces you hoped were in a good mood that day. This wasn't poetic symbolism. It was practical belief. The Romans assumed the world worked because it was divided into manageable parts and each part had a divine caretaker. If something went wrong, it wasn't random. It meant a specific relationship had been mishandled. Somewhere, something had been ignored, rushed, or performed incorrectly. And the terrifying part, you couldn't just remember a few major gods and be done with it. The list was long. Long enough that no one ever felt fully confident they'd covered everything. There were gods for beginnings and gods for endings, gods for transitions between spaces, gods for entrances, exits, and the brief moment when you were technically in neither. Gods for what things were supposed to do and gods for what happened when they didn't. Daily life became a maze of invisible tripwires, not dramatic ones, subtle ones, the kind you don't notice until after you've already stepped on them. Forgetting to acknowledge a god didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like forgetting to say thank you to someone holding a ladder you were standing on. This created a culture of constant low-level caution. People didn't think, I hope this pleases the gods to be. They thought, I hope this doesn't upset the wrong one. The goal wasn't divine approval. It was divine neutrality. You weren't aiming for blessings, you were aiming to get through the day unnoticed. The humour from a distance is that nothing was too small to matter. Hinges mattered, corners mattered, crossings mattered, spaces between spaces mattered. A Roman moving through their home wasn't just navigating architecture, they were navigating jurisdiction. Each step passed through zones of responsibility that weren't always clearly marked. And unlike modern systems, there was no instruction manual, no single list, no universal agreement on who was responsible for what in every situation. This meant people relied on tradition, habit, and imitation. You did things the way your parents did them, not because you knew why, but because they were still alive, which suggested it worked. This divine micromanagement didn't make life feel meaningful. It made life feel fragile. If the world depended on correct behavior down to the level of doors and drains, then stability was always temporary. Order had to be constantly renewed, maintained, tended, like a house that would collapse if you stopped fixing small cracks. And because everything had a god, everything carried risk, even inaction, especially inaction. Forgetting was dangerous, being careless was dangerous, being tired was dangerous. The gods didn't care if you were exhausted, they cared if you were correct. So people learned to build rituals into routine, small gestures, brief acknowledgements, tiny habits repeated daily until they faded into muscle memory. Not because they were dramatic, but because drama attracted attention, and attention was risky. The strange result was a world where the divine didn't feel distant or majestic. It felt bureaucratic, like an endless system of offices, each handling a narrow responsibility. none of them communicating clearly, and all of them capable of causing trouble if their box wasn't checked. From the outside it sounds absurd, from the inside it was survival logic. If misfortune struck, you didn't ask if a god was involved. You asked which one, and then you wondered whether it had been the door, the hinge, the threshold, or something even smaller you hadn't thought about yet. So no, you didn't forget the door in ancient Rome, you offended it. If there was one universal truth for ordinary Romans, it was this: offending a god required no effort at all. You didn't need to wage war against heaven, make bold sacrilegious statements, or declare philosophical independence. No, the Roman gods were far more efficient. You could anger one simply by existing imperfectly. The gods, after all, had standards. You, unfortunately, had hands that slipped, words that stumbled, memories that wandered, and a daily schedule that refused to cooperate with divine expectations. And the problem wasn't just that mistakes happened, it was that the rules weren't clearly posted anywhere. The universe didn't hand out pamphlets, the gods didn't leave comment cards. You just lived in hope that whatever error you made today was too small to trigger cosmic retaliation. That hope, however, was often misplaced. Romans understood that divine offense was rarely dramatic. You didn't feel a rumble in the sky or a sudden chill down your spine. The gods preferred subtlety. Their disapproval manifested slowly, quietly, and most maddeningly after the fact. You might botch a prayer in the morning and not learn until next week that you had jeopardized your luck, your crops, or your future health. It wasn't personal, it was simply the system. A system where correctness mattered, precision mattered, and your awareness of either didn't. This uncertainty produced a very specific Roman emotional climate. Preventative fear. Not panic, but vigilance. Not hysteria, but attention sharpened by the knowledge that the universe graded everything and did not grade on a curve. You might slip during a ritual and mispronounce a word, just a single syllable, swallowed too quickly. To you it was a tiny mistake. To the gods it was a breach of contract, and they didn't care that you were nervous, distracted, or trying your best. Rituals worked because they were exact. Anything less rendered them null, void, or, worst of all, offensive. This wasn't paranoia, it was theology. Romans believed the gods interacted with humans based on correct performance, not intention. You could have a heart full of sincerity and still offend a deity because you tied the ritual cord incorrectly or spilled wine in the wrong direction. The gods weren't looking into your soul, they were looking at your technique. And inevitably, this fostered a culture where ordinary people felt perpetually at fault. A Roman didn't wake up thinking, how can I be a better person today? They woke up thinking, what did I forget to do yesterday? It was a worldview built on retroactive anxiety. Fear not of what you plan to do wrong, but what you'd already done wrong without knowing. This is where the true comedy of Roman religion emerges, not in the gods themselves, but in the human scramble to keep up. Imagine spilling a cup of wine during a small domestic ritual. No one saw, no one commented, but you knew. And worse, the gods knew. And now you'd just created more work for yourself. Because fixing divine offense wasn't simple. You couldn't just say, sorry, my bad. Apologies didn't work unless they followed strict procedures, involved the correct offerings, and were performed with the precision you failed to demonstrate the first time. If a ritual failed, the solution wasn't adjustment, it was repetition. You had to redo the entire ceremony, start to finish, with the hope that this time the gods would acknowledge your competence instead of your trembling hands. And if you didn't know what mistake you made, too bad. You still had to fix it. One of the most common Roman rituals was the piaculum, an offering made to atone for offences you couldn't identify. It was spiritual damage control. Something went wrong, I don't know what, but please accept this sacrifice as a general apology for whatever I did or failed to do. This wasn't thought of as neurotic. It was practical. When divine anger was possible at any time for reasons you could not perceive, the most sensible thing you could do was cover all your bases, repeatedly. Of course, this system made life feel like a constant exam in a language you were never fully fluent in. And while modern people often imagine religious life as providing comfort, Roman religion provided structure. Comfort was optional, structure was mandatory. In such a world, it was entirely possible to offend a god without even participating in a ritual. The mistake might be environmental, accidental, or simply unlucky. You might cross a boundary without noticing it, touch an object without realizing it was sacred, speak carelessly in a place where silence was expected. Romans didn't worry about whether moral failure would bring punishment, they worried about whether carelessness would. And because divine reactions were delayed, you could never tie cause and effect neatly together. Misfortune, illness, or disaster might arrive weeks after the offence. By then you'd forgotten the mistake entirely. But the gods hadn't. The frightening part wasn't that the gods were cruel, it was that they remembered everything while humans barely remembered where they put their sandals. The good news? The gods didn't lose the track of you. The bad news? They didn't lose track of your slip-ups either. For an ordinary Roman, the most shocking truth about the gods wasn't that they were powerful, unpredictable, or occasionally in a destructive mood. It was that they didn't care who you were as a person. Your intentions, your kindness, your integrity, none of it held any weight in divine calculations. A generous heart couldn't fix a sloppy ritual. A lifetime of loyalty meant nothing if you stumbled over the final syllable of a prayer. And if you were wondering whether the gods rewarded moral excellence, the Roman answer would be only if moral excellence came with perfect technique. To the Roman gods, goodness was irrelevant. Precision was the only currency that mattered. Roman religion was not a matter of personal faith or emotional expression. It was a technical system, an enormous cosmic machine that functioned correctly only when humans performed rituals with exactness. Think of it as trying to appease beings who evaluate you the same way a banker evaluates paperwork. Not by how hard you tried, but by whether you followed the instructions to the letter. The gods didn't want your love, they wanted your accuracy. And this shaped Roman attitudes in remarkable ways. Someone kind, charitable, and responsible could easily fall out of divine favour if they rushed through a ritual or mixed up the order of gestures. Meanwhile, someone selfish, cruel, or morally questionable could maintain perfect standing with the gods simply by completing every ritual with flawless execution. Holiness wasn't a matter of heart, it was a matter of choreography. Imagine trying to live a good life while knowing that goodness wasn't the part the gods cared about. You could be the kindest person in your insular block, but if you whispered the offering prayer too softly or tied the sacrificial ribbons in the wrong direction, the gods weren't moved. They were offended. And unlike a human audience, they never clapped politely and said, "Well, at least the effort was nice." There was no trophy for participation in Roman religion. This emphasis on precision created an interesting dynamic. Fear of error overshadowed fear of immorality. Romans did not grow up worrying whether their hearts were pure. They worried whether their timing was correct. They feared not vice, but mispronunciation. This is the only culture in history where a lisp could be considered a spiritual hazard. And because rituals were often long, detailed, and heavily formalized, there were endless opportunities to fail. The priest might lose his place, the incense could burn too quickly, the flute player might miss his cue, a dog might bark at the wrong moment. If anything broke the rhythm, if anything disrupted the sequence, the ritual had to be restarted from the beginning, not because the gods were sadists, but because the gods were perfectionists. This wasn't punishment in Roman thinking, this was maintenance. Rituals worked like legal contracts. If you got the wording wrong, the agreement didn't take effect. The gods weren't angry that you were imperfect. They were indifferent to imperfection. The ritual either matched the required formula or it didn't. Correctness created a bridge between mortal and divine. Incorrectness created silence. Imagine the pressure of that world. You weren't trying to win divine affection. You were trying not to void divine paperwork. And this is where Roman morality diverged sharply from modern expectations. In many religious traditions, moral failure is a central concern. But in Rome, morality mattered mostly to society, not to the gods. Cheating your neighbour, lying to your family, or exploiting your workers might give you a bad reputation among humans, but it didn't necessarily bother the gods. But forgetting a grain offering, misaligning a ritual gesture, allowing an impure object near an altar, that could undo an entire community's protection. So Romans lived in a world where moral behaviour was optional, but procedural competence was essential. A well-executed ritual could protect the guilty. A flawed one could doom the innocent. Justice had nothing to do with it. The gods weren't moral judges. They were cosmic administrators checking whether the forms were properly filled. This is why Rome invested so much in training priests, augurs, and religious officials. Their job wasn't to be holy. Their job was to be accurate. They were specialists in divine correctness, ensuring that every gesture met the invisible specifications of heaven. The fear wasn't that a priest might be corrupt. The fear was that a priest might be clumsy. Even ordinary households carried this attitude into their daily routines. Families rehearsed prayers, they memorized formulas, they corrected one another if someone spoke too slowly, too quickly, or with an unintended pause. This wasn't religious enthusiasm, it was risk management. And the strangest part, Romans weren't resentful of this system. They accepted it. The gods were powerful, distant, and uninterested in human drama. Emotional closeness wasn't part of the deal. What humans could offer was competence, not love. And in return, the gods provided stability, so long as the rituals were done right. In such a world, the ethical question wasn't, am I a good person? It was, did I say that correctly? No one asked whether the gods understood their feelings. The gods understood procedures. Feelings were irrelevant. Virtue might warm your heart, but correct pronunciation kept your city standing. To an ordinary Roman, the sacrificial altar was less a place of worship and more a customer service counter, except instead of talking to a representative, you offered a sheep and hoped the divine office processed your request without sending it back stamped rejected. Sacrifices weren't about emotional devotion or spiritual bonding. They were transactions, negotiations, practical exchanges between mortal need and divine power. The modern idea of prayer is often intimate, reflective, or heartfelt. In Rome, that was nice, but what really got the gods' attention was meat. Meat, wine, incense, and anything else that signaled, I come offering something valuable. Please don't destroy my life this season. It was less, I love you, great Jupiter, and more, here's a freshly prepared bribe, please don't ruin the harvest. This wasn't cynicism. It was the entire structure of Roman religion. The gods gave protection, luck, and stability only if humans provided the correct offerings. It was a contract, not a romance. Humans didn't cry out to the gods for emotional comfort. They sent offerings like payments toward cosmic insurance premiums. And livestock, unfortunately for them, were the preferred currency. A cow wasn't just a cow, it was a peace offering. A sheep wasn't just a sheep, it was a plea for stability. A piglet wasn't just a squealing barn creature. It was a small, edible apology. Whenever the gods seemed restless, Romans didn't sit around philosophizing. They checked the cattle inventory. The moment thunder cracked or a ritual hiccuped, farmers had flashbacks to earlier sacrifices and whispered, not again. But the logic behind sacrifices was deadly serious. Romans believed the gods consumed the essence of the offering, the sacred life heat rising from the burning flesh. Humans got to eat what remained, but only after the gods had received their share. In this way, sacrifices reinforced social ties, political unity, and divine order all at once. You weren't just killing an animal, you were restoring symmetry between earth and heaven. And because the gods demanded precision, sacrifices had to be performed perfectly. The animal couldn't limp, it couldn't flinch at the wrong moment, it couldn't escape or cry out in an unlucky way. The priest performing the ritual had to maintain flawless posture, voice, and timing. If a single detail went wrong, even something trivial like a tool slipping or a flame sputtering, the entire ritual had to be started over. Imagine the stress of hosting a dinner party where the guest of honour is invisible, highly judgmental, and has the power to smite your city if the tablecloth is crooked. But Romans didn't sacrifice simply to ask for good things, they sacrificed to prevent bad things. If a bad omen appeared, if a minor ritual was performed incorrectly, or if misfortune loomed on the horizon, the first instinct wasn't reflection or repentance, it was, we need to schedule a sacrifice immediately. The gods were not assumed to be patient or forgiving, they were assumed to respond to offerings the way humans respond to refunds, faster when it's expensive. Fear drove the culture of appeasement more than devotion did. A good Roman didn't bring a sacrifice because they felt warm affection toward Jupiter. They brought it because Jupiter was powerful, unpredictable, and easily annoyed. Love didn't keep the world running, ritual payments did, and sacrifices were not always private affairs. Public sacrifices were major events, performed by priests, magistrates, and even emperors. These weren't just religious acts, they were political performances. A successful sacrifice meant the gods approved of the current leaders. A botched one implied the gods were irritated, and possibly that the priesthood was incompetent, or worse, that the state had lost divine favour. Imagine being a politician whose career depended on whether a bull twitched at the wrong moment. But despite the anxiety, sacrifices created a structured rhythm in Roman life. Festivals, civic ceremonies, military campaigns, and harvests were all punctuated by offerings. Every major decision, from entering battle to founding a colony, required divine consultation and divine compensation. Romans rarely acted without checking if the gods were in a cooperative mood. This made public life feel perpetually at stake. A community didn't merely gather to eat, celebrate, or pray. It gathered to ensure the gods were satisfied. And since one person's mistake could void the entire ritual, everyone watched closely, praying silently that nobody sneezed, stumbled, or had a bird land on their head mid-ceremony. And what happened if the gods weren't satisfied? You escalated. Bigger offerings, more expensive animals. Elaborate ceremonies meant to correct spiritual mistakes. A relatively cheap sacrifice might cover minor concerns, but major divine anger required something impressive, like a massive bull or a large-scale ritual funded by the state treasury. The message was clear. If your problems grew, so did the number of animals involved. This wasn't cruelty in Roman eyes, it was maintenance. Ritual upkeep. Like feeding a furnace that kept the world warm. The gods didn't need love. They needed acknowledgement, tribute, and the occasional cow roasted in their honour. And so, throughout Roman history, when storms raged, crops failed, or omens multiplied, the livestock population knew what was coming. The gods were upset, and animals paid for it first. In ancient Rome, danger didn't always come from invading armies, corrupt politicians, or collapsing buildings. Sometimes it came from a pigeon landing on the wrong rooftop. Sometimes it came from a sneeze at the wrong moment. And sometimes it came from absolutely nothing. Because nothing in Roman thinking was rarely just nothing. Silence, stillness, and unexpected calm could all be warnings. If the modern world runs on notifications, Rome ran on omens, which were essentially the ancient equivalent of the universe sending cryptic text messages you were expected to decode immediately. The problem was that the universe had terrible handwriting. To an ordinary Roman, life felt like a scavenger hunt for signs. Only the clues were scattered everywhere, the rules for interpreting them were inconsistent, and the consequences for misreading them ranged from mild embarrassment to citywide doom. Anything could be an omen. A thunderclap, a sudden gust of wind, an animal behaving strangely, a household object falling over, or a person tripping in public. The world was full of signals, and every signal might be a warning. This wasn't superstition in the modern sense, it was a worldview. Romans believed the gods communicated not through emotional whispers or divine revelations, but through interruptions, small breaks in the expected flow of life. When nature behaved unpredictably, when objects moved unexpectedly, when events didn't follow their usual pattern, something larger was at work. This meant, unfortunately, that the entire environment was a potential hazard. Imagine trying to enjoy breakfast while watching your spoon out of the corner of your eye, because if it slips off the table, you'll spend the rest of the day wondering, whether Mars is trying to warn you about something. Or picture going for a peaceful morning walk only to panic because a dog barked 3 times in a way that felt intentional. Romans lived in that constant hum of interpretive tension. Take lightning. A modern person shrugs and says, weather. A Roman says, someone up there is furious, and immediately begins worrying whether the target of that fury happens to be them. A thunderstorm was less meteorology and more celestial commentary, a sort of divine Yelp review with lightning bolts standing in for star ratings. And birds, of course, were a whole category of omens unto themselves. But while the augurs handled the official bird watching, ordinary Romans were not exempt from noticing feathered behaviour. A bird flying left instead of right could signal trouble. A bird calling at night could foretell unrest. A bird simply existing too close to you at the wrong moment could derail your plans. It was a society where pigeons unintentionally ruined careers. But omens weren't limited to nature. Human accidents were equally suspicious. A person stumbling on the way to an important event? Terrible omen. Someone dropping a jug and it smashing in an unfortunate way? Also an omen. A sneeze interrupting a conversation? Definitely a message, though what it meant depended entirely on who sneezed and when. And because ordinary Romans didn't have access to the official priests every time something weird happened, they had to interpret signs themselves, often using the highly scientific method of gut instinct mixed with mild panic. No one wanted to make the wrong decision after ignoring something the universe had clearly tried to say. The fear wasn't just of punishment, it was of missing the moment where disaster might have been preventable. This turned everyday life into a kind of cosmic obstacle course. A dropped cup wasn't clumsiness, it was a warning. A strange noise wasn't coincidence, it was communication. A sudden chill wasn't temperature, it was an omen wearing a thin disguise. And because Romans assumed meaning existed everywhere, they became experts at reading the slightest irregularity. A crack in the pavement might be an omen of instability. A fire burning too quickly might symbolize danger. Even the behavior of shadows, too long, too short, oddly shaped, could be interpreted as divine commentary. It was a world where normalcy felt like a tightrope, and the slightest wobble meant you needed to reconsider your entire day. But the real source of stress wasn't that omens existed, it was that they were unavoidable. You didn't seek them out. They found you. At home, at work, in the street, in the marketplace, you could be having an excellent day, feeling confident and optimistic, until the universe sent you a subtle nope in the form of a crow cawing exactly 1 time too many. And omens had an annoying habit of appearing when you least wanted them. Before weddings, before business deals, before travel, before anything important. They were cosmic interruptions that forced you to reconsider every plan you had made. A perfectly arranged schedule could disintegrate because a goat bleated ominously at the wrong moment. Of course, ordinary Romans didn't find this funny, but from a modern perspective, it's hard not to see the absurdity. Imagine living in constant negotiation with a universe that threw hints like a passive-aggressive roommate, always signalling something, never explaining what. And the worst part? The universe never apologized for the mixed messages. If it sneezed metaphorically through a sudden noise, a strange shadow, or an unusual breeze, it was up to you to figure out why. The gods didn't clarify, they didn't call back, they didn't leave follow-up instructions. Romans weren't terrified of omens because omens were big and dramatic. They were terrified because omens were small, constant, and personal. They turned ordinary life into a high-stakes puzzle. The universe sneezed, and in Rome that meant someone, possibly you, had done something wrong. In ancient Rome, you might think your boss, your family, or the local magistrate controlled your daily schedule. But no, the real authority was the bird population. Ordinary Romans lived in a world where pigeons, ravens, owls, hawks, and the occasional seagull had veto power over human plans. Birds weren't just animals. They were celestial messengers, airborne spiritual consultants, and unintentional tyrants of daily decision-making. The system behind this was augury. the official practice of interpreting the god's will through the behaviour of birds. It wasn't a quirky cultural hobby. It was a deeply respected institution with legal force. Nothing important could proceed without avian approval. Elections, military campaigns, construction projects, business deals, public ceremonies, even marriages. Life paused until the birds weighed in. Imagine trying to build a career while pigeons decided whether today was an acceptable day to get promoted. Augurs, the priests trained in bird reading, were considered essential to Rome's survival. They didn't speak to the gods directly. They didn't receive dreams or visions. They watched birds. Birds flying left or right, high or low, eagerly or reluctantly. Birds eating enthusiastically or refusing food entirely. Birds making noise or staying conspicuously silent. Even the type of bird mattered. A raven didn't mean the same thing as a chicken, and a chicken certainly didn't mean the same thing as an eagle. But augury wasn't just for grand public events. The mentality behind it seeped into everyday life. Ordinary Romans might not have been trained augurs, but they were still highly aware that the universe had opinions, and that birds were the ones delivering them. If a person walked outside and immediately saw a bird behaving oddly, it was often considered safer to turn around, go back inside and try again later. Plans weren't cancelled because someone lacked courage. They were cancelled because a sparrow gave a disapproving vibe. This turned birds into accidental bureaucrats. A pigeon's random wing flutter could delay a ceremony. A hawk's unexpected appearance could halt negotiations. A flock suddenly changing direction could cause panic. It was the ancient world's version of waiting for an email from someone important, except the someone was a bird, and the message was interpreted by priests who might disagree among themselves. For the average Roman, this meant that life was filled with the constant possibility of sudden feathered interruption. You could wake up ready for an important journey, only to watch a crow perch on your roof and think, well, that's it. Trip cancelled. You could plan a wedding, only for an owl to hoot ominously and force you to reschedule, possibly for months. But the most notorious omen involved sacred chickens. Yes, chickens. Roman generals carried cages of them into battle. Before a campaign, the chickens were offered grain. If they ate eagerly, it was a sign the gods approved. If they didn't, it was a sign the gods strongly disapproved. Imagine commanding thousands of soldiers, only to have your entire strategy hinged on whether a group of chickens had an appetite. This system was so powerful that even emperors were expected to obey it. One famous general, Publius Claudius Pulcher, mocked the ritual when the chickens refused to eat. Annoyed, he reportedly said, "If they won't eat, let them drink," and ordered them thrown into the sea. The gods, unimpressed with his sense of humour, ensured he suffered a catastrophic naval defeat. If there was a moral, it wasn't about arrogance. It was about never angering a chicken with divine job duties. For ordinary Romans, though augury wasn't a matter of impending battles, it was daily life. Birds shaped the psychological landscape of the city. People moved with quiet sensitivity to small signs, a bird crossing their path, a sudden flock overhead, an unexpected call in the evening. In a world where every action felt spiritually monitored, birds were the auditors. What made augury especially challenging was that birds didn't have schedules. They didn't care that you needed to arrive at the market by noon or meet someone before sunset. They certainly didn't care about your deadlines, your savings, your health, or your sanity. They did what birds do, flew around, searching for food, minding their own business, and yet Romans had to interpret these natural meaningless movements as divine commentary. This created that a bizarre form of tension. People were constantly looking up, constantly alert, constantly aware that the sky might interrupt their plans at any moment. A random seagull drifting inland could start rumours. A silent morning could provoke anxiety. A flock forming the wrong shape could ruin someone's week. And the most amusing part? Even Romans knew birds were unreliable. Chickens could be moody, ravens could be dramatic, pigeons could be confused, and yet the system persisted, because no one wanted to be the person who ignored a bird and then suffered misfortune later. Fear, tradition, and divine precedent kept everyone obedient to the whims of creatures who couldn't even understand the concept of a calendar. Life decisions held hostage by pigeons may sound ridiculous today, but in Rome it was normal. Wise, even. Because if the birds disapproved, your plans didn't simply change. The gods themselves had rejected them. Your greatest enemy wasn't war, famine, or politics. It was a bird with strong opinions and terrible communication skills. For ordinary Romans, nighttime wasn't a peaceful break from the day's anxieties. It was simply a new shift in the endless job of surviving divine attention. Sleep might restore the body, but the mind remained on duty because dreams weren't private fantasies or harmless mental noise. Dreams were mail, delivered straight from the gods, and they rarely wrote friendly letters. If the daylight hours forced Romans to watch the world for omens, the nighttime hours allowed the gods to bypass all subtlety and drop their messages directly into a person's unconscious. Rest? That was a luxury for people whose dreams weren't used as a cosmic courier system. Romans believed dreams fell into recognizable categories: messages, warnings, commands, previews of the future, divine scoldings, and of course terrifying nonsense that still needed interpretation just in case it wasn't nonsense. The gods did not respect boundaries. They did not care that you were tired, overwhelmed, or simply trying to fall asleep without thinking about tomorrow's potential disasters. They slipped in anyway, like supervisors arriving unannounced to your home after hours with a list of urgent concerns. You didn't close your eyes at night. You opened your inbox. This belief meant Romans approached sleep differently than modern people do. They didn't assume dreams reflected emotions or memories. Dreams were not a psychological process, they were external communications. A dream could arrive with perfect clarity, delivering unmistakable instructions. More often, though, it arrived as confusing symbolism: animals behaving strangely, impossible landscapes, sudden transformations, voices calling from nowhere, or unexplained disasters. Even the most bewildering dream could be a message, and if it was a message, you were obligated to figure out what it meant. This transformed sleeping into an intellectual hazard. You weren't just lying down, you were entering a realm where the gods had free access to your mind and zero interest in simplifying their metaphors. Imagine trying to rest while knowing that at any moment Jupiter might burst into your dreaming brain and tell you, through a dramatic montage of burning fields and talking goats, that you forgot an offering last week. Nightmares weren't merely frightening, they were suspicious. Ordinary Romans couldn't wake up from a bad dream, sigh in relief and move on. They woke up thinking, what did that mean? Who sent it? What am I supposed to do now? A nightmare wasn't just fear, it was homework. The anxiety deepened because dreams weren't always about you. Some dreams delivered warnings meant for the entire household, the neighborhood, or even the state. Imagine waking from a terrifying vision and realizing you now had the burden of figuring out whether it foretold famine, disease, or simply that you ate something questionable before bed. Romans had no choice but to take dreams seriously because history had taught them that ignoring divine dream messages could lead to disaster. Many political and military decisions, some disastrous and some triumphant, were influenced by what leaders saw in their sleep. A general who dismissed his dreams might be considered reckless. A statesman who ignored a night vision risked being blamed for any resulting misfortune. For ordinary Romans, this meant every dream carried at least the potential for real-world consequences. You never knew when your unconscious would be drafted into the service of divine communication. This created an informal economy of dream interpreters, experienced individuals who could decode symbols, reference established interpretations, and determine whether a dream was divine, demonic, prophetic, or simply indigestion disguised as revelation. People consulted them the way modern people consult doctors, therapists, or legal advisors. Only in Rome could a man's career prospects depend on whether his dream interpreter believed the rooster in last night's dream represented opportunity or impending doom. And it wasn't just that dreams were messages, it was that they were unavoidable. You could miss an omen during the day if you were distracted, but you couldn't stop dreaming. Unless you refused to sleep, which understandably some people tried during especially anxious periods. But sleep deprivation came with its own dangers, and no Roman wanted to irritate the gods by appearing unavailable for their nighttime correspondence. Even pleasant dreams were approached with caution. A joyful vision could be a promise, or it could be a warning disguised as encouragement. Romans learned not to trust dreams too quickly. The gods enjoyed symbolism far too much to be straightforward. But perhaps the most exhausting part of Roman dream culture was the follow-up. If a dream seemed important, you needed to take action, perform a ritual, make an offering, consult a priest, alter your plans, or warn others. Dreams created responsibility. They generated work. They demanded interpretation and response. And in a culture terrified of angering the gods, failing to follow up on a dream was simply not an option. Sleep, in short, was not rest. It was a nightly performance review. This transformed the bedroom into a place of vulnerability. The moment you lay down, you were entering a realm beyond your control. You couldn't predict what the gods would send, or whether you'd remember it correctly, or whether the meaning would be obvious. You simply had to hope that tonight's dream, if any, would be mercifully unimportant. But the truth was clear to every ordinary Roman. You didn't rest at night. You received instructions, and good luck ignoring them, because the gods never forgot who read their messages and who didn't. If the streets of Rome felt watched, the inside of your home felt monitored, not by ghosts, burglars, or nosy neighbours, but by divine residents with front-row seats to every moment of your domestic life. Ordinary Romans lived with the constant awareness that their houses were not private shelters or emotional retreats. Their houses were shared spaces, less like personal homes and more like apartments co-owned with several unseen supervisors who never slept, never left, and always noticed everything. These ever-present overseers were the Lares and Penates, the household gods. While the major gods governed storms, wars, and political disasters, these smaller deities handled something far more intrusive, your everyday life. They weren't distant, abstract forces. They were believed to live inside the home, particularly in the hearth area, or wherever your family placed their small shrine. Imagine growing up knowing that even your dinner had an audience. The Lares were guardians of place, spirits who protected the physical boundaries of the home. The Penates guarded the pantry, food stores, and prosperity. Together, they created a divine surveillance system designed not to punish evil, but to ensure order, routine, and proper household behavior. When Romans said the household was sacred, they did not mean emotionally sacred. They meant literally occupied by divinities who expected respect and regular offerings. This meant no part of daily domestic life was spiritually neutral. Waking up, cooking meals, sweeping the floor, storing grain, lighting the fire, everything had to be done with awareness. The household gods were not shy. They didn't wait for festivals, omens, or dreams. They were right there, watching, judging, sometimes helping, sometimes punishing, always present. Your home wasn't your escape from Rome's public rituals. It was the location of more rituals. Every Roman family maintained a lararium, a small household shrine decorated with miniature figurines, painted symbols, or simple clay offerings. This wasn't a decorative shelf. It was the spiritual nerve center of the home. Every day, someone, usually the head of the household, offered a bit of wine, incense, bread, or food to keep the gods satisfied. Miss a day, bad idea, skip a ritual, worse, forget entirely, absolutely catastrophic. The gods didn't need to strike lightning or send an omen. They could express displeasure through something far more efficient: domestic inconvenience, a broken pot, spoiled grain, a sick family member, a malfunctioning hearth fire, bad luck at the market. Anything could be interpreted as a divine reminder that offerings were overdue. This meant ordinary Romans developed a kind of domestic anxiety, the fear that some household mishap wasn't clumsiness, but divine feedback. The spilled oil wasn't just messy, it was meaningful. The bread that didn't rise wasn't your fault. It it was theirs, telling you something was off. And because these gods were not universal but personal, their involvement felt intimate in the most unsettling way. The Lares were believed to guard not just the house but the family line itself. Generations passed under their supervision. Your ancestors had honoured them, your children would honour them, and you are now responsible for maintaining that invisible contract. They weren't watching you because they disliked you, they were watching because they were invested, which, for an ordinary Roman, somehow made it worse. The Penates, meanwhile, had the noble duty of safeguarding food supplies. That sounds comforting until you realise it meant your pantry behaved like a spiritual barometer. Food spoiled, grain infested, jars cracked. Something was wrong and you had better figure out what. Maybe you forgot an offering. Maybe you kept the pantry too messy. Maybe the gods simply wanted more attention. In Rome, even your kitchen demanded piety. What made this particularly exhausting was that the Lares and Penates didn't take vacations. They didn't leave the house when you did. They didn't sleep, and they certainly didn't look away. Other gods might visit through omens, dreams, or rituals, but the household gods lived where you lived. Their presence wasn't symbolic, it was spatial. You shared walls, rooms, meals, and responsibilities with beings who cared far more about daily upkeep than you did, and you couldn't escape them by stepping outside. If anything, the Lares of the crossroads, Lares Compitales, took over the moment you stepped into the street, continuing the chain of divine supervision, the way security cameras hand off tracking from room to room. It created a world where the home wasn't a refuge from divine attention, it was the core of it. Romans didn't experience privacy the way modern people do. Even solitude wasn't shunned. The home was always occupied by an unseen audience whose expectations shaped behaviour. A household that fell out of harmony with its gods wasn't just spiritually troubled, it was socially and economically vulnerable. But there was an upside. If pleased, the household gods offered stability, prosperity, health, protection from a misfortune. They were not cruel, they were exacting. They represented a transaction, not affection. A Roman didn't expect them to love the family. They expected the gods to maintain order in exchange for proper ritual attention. Yet one thing never changed. The awareness that inside your own walls, the gods had the best seat in the house. So no, your house in ancient Rome wasn't haunted. It was supervised meticulously, constantly, and with divine interest in your pantry organisation. For an ordinary Roman, nothing was more terrifying than the sky going quiet at the wrong time, the soil turning stubborn, or the plants growing with suspicious hesitation. Crop failure wasn't an inconvenience, it was a direct message. When your life depended on what sprouted from the earth, the agricultural gods weren't distant, poetic symbols of nature. They were volatile business partners whose bad moods could starve you. Every seed you planted, every furrow you ploughed, every raindrop that fell carried spiritual consequences. Farming in Rome wasn't just labour, it was negotiation, and the soil itself felt like a divine scorecard. Romans didn't treat agriculture casually. They had an entire lineup of gods dedicated to the process, each responsible for a specific stage of growth. There was Ceres, who watched over grain and fertility, Tellus, who governed the earth's ability to produce, Robigus, who protected crops from blight and disease and, critically, was known to take offence easily. Saya guarded the seed, Segetia watched over seedlings, Tutilina protected the harvest. If you thought you could plant a field without divine management, Rome would politely or urgently correct you. And this spiritual landscape meant farmers couldn't simply blame weather, pests, or poor soil quality. Those were symptoms. The cause was always divine. Too much rain? Someone angered a weather god, too little rain, someone else forgot an offering. A field full of rot? Well, that was clearly Robigus announcing that he had been neglected. The anxiety was relentless. To plant was to risk offending the wrong god. To reap was to hope the gods remained patient. To survive was to pray that the mood of heaven didn't swing abruptly toward displeasure. Even a successful harvest didn't bring relief. It brought a fresh cycle of worrying about the next one. The Roman farmer's calendar was essentially a list of spiritual responsibilities disguised as agricultural tasks. Festivals weren't celebrations, they were compulsory maintenance rituals meant to keep divine forces stable. The Robigalia, for instance, required the sacrifice of a dog to appease Robigus and prevent grain disease. It was grim, it was costly, and it was considered smarter than risking divine wrath. Agriculture demanded precision, just like every other part of Roman religious life. Ploughing the wrong way, planting at the wrong time, or ignoring a suspicious sign in the sky could trigger panic. A sudden frost wasn't a meteorological event. It was a divine reprimand. A pest outbreak wasn't biology. It was a warning. A scorching wind wasn't climate. It was the gods communicating in a heated tone. And Romans weren't passive in the face of these signs. They reacted quickly and dramatically. A strange pattern in the clouds could cause entire villages to stop working and perform emergency rituals. A plague on crops might prompt families to gather at dawn and walk the fields, chanting prayers in a mixture of hope, fear, and agricultural desperation. This constant vulnerability shaped the psychology of rural life. City dwellers had household gods watching their food supply, but farmers had entire acres monitored by a divine committee. There was nowhere to hide from agricultural judgment. Your fields were as public to the gods as your altar. A farmer might convince themselves they'd been careful, they'd honoured rituals, they'd done everything right. But if the wheat grew thin or the vines wilted, something had gone wrong spiritually, and finding out what was now a matter of survival. A failed crop wasn't just a lost season, it was a statement. A divine message delivered in the cruelest medium, hunger. Romans understood that food insecurity was a religious crisis. Grain shortages destabilized families, armies, governments, and entire regions. When fields faltered, people didn't blame economic systems or distribution chains. They blamed themselves. Something had been missed. Something had been misread. Something sacred had been mishandled. This personal burden created the odd mixture of humility and dread in Roman agricultural culture. Farmers saw themselves as stewards, not masters, of the land. But unlike modern environmental stewardship, theirs wasn't about preserving nature for moral reasons. It was about avoiding cosmic punishment for procedural errors. The earth worked until it didn't. And when it didn't, someone paid. That someone was usually the farmer. It's easy today to romanticize ancient rural life as peaceful, natural, and grounded. In Rome, it was grounded, yes, in fear. The ground itself could turn against you at any moment, not because of ecological cycles, but because one of the gods overseeing sowing, sprouting, ripening, or harvesting had decided they weren't satisfied. And nothing, absolutely nothing, frightened a Roman farmer more than the quiet, still morning after a storm, when you walked outside to examine your fields and felt the unsettling suspicion that the sky had passed judgment during the night. Weather wasn't weather, it was feedback, and every crop failure was personal. The gods made sure of it. For an ordinary Roman, falling sick was never just a matter of biology. It was a statement, a signal, a divine memo delivered through aches, chills, and embarrassing rashes. Illness wasn't random misfortune. It was evidence that somewhere, somehow, someone had offended the wrong being. A cough wasn't just a cough. It was spiritual commentary. A fever wasn't just a fever. It was a warning, a rebuke, a cosmic sticky note pasted onto your forehead. You messed up. Figure it out. This worldview made sickness terrifying, not simply because it hurt, but because it meant something, and that meaning could destroy your peace of mind long before the illness destroyed your body. Romans didn't have germ theory. They didn't understand transmission, bacteria, sanitation, or viruses. What they did understand, what they believed with absolute conviction, was that the gods communicated through disruptions in the human body. If health meant harmony, illness meant discord. And discord always had a cause. In a Roman household, the moment someone fell ill, the first question wasn't, what did they catch? It was, what did we do? Illness prompted investigation, interrogation, and frantic memory scanning. The family would trace back the past few days, searching for missed rituals, clumsy prayers, slighted household gods, forgotten offerings, or any moment where someone behaved too casually in front of a shrine. In Rome, you didn't get colds, you got consequences, and this created a cultural anxiety far deeper than physical discomfort. Sickness carried shame, not immorality shame, but incompetence shame. Illness implied ritual negligence, a broken spiritual contract, or a moment of disrespect that now threatened the entire household. Even children's fevers could spark panic, not because the fever itself was mysterious, but because the gods seemed to be aiming their anger uncomfortably close to the next generation. Every disease felt personal. This is why healing rituals in Rome were not simply medical, they were apologies. Offerings were made, temples were visited, priests were consulted, sacred herbs were gathered, not because they cured the body, but because they soothed the offended deity who had allowed the illness to spread. Even the famous healing god Aesculapius wasn't worshipped out of gratitude for his compassion. He was worshipped because he had influence over whether your symptoms worsened. The stakes were brutally high. A wrong diagnosis meant treating the wrong god. A botched ritual meant prolonging the divine displeasure. A household could spiral emotionally as they tried to determine whether the sickness was punishment for a single misstep or a sign of broader spiritual disorder. Sick individuals were often treated with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. Sympathy because illness was painful. Suspicion because illness implied guilt, even if the guilt was accidental. If someone in a home fell repeatedly ill, neighbours might whisper that the family had angered a deity or neglected sacred duties. The illness didn't just weaken the body, it damaged reputations. And because Romans believed signs were everywhere, they scrutinized symptoms as clues. A sudden pain meant urgency. A slow fever meant simmering divine irritation. Strange dreams accompanying sickness? Absolutely a sign that a god had more to say. A relapse after seeming recovery was a sure indication that the previous ritual had been insufficient. No one suffered in silence because silence itself was suspicious. A person who hid their illness risked hiding a message the entire household needed to interpret. Illness wasn't private, it was communal business. Some diseases came with their own divine associations. Plague, terrifying, unpredictable and devastating, was linked to Apollo, whose arrows could strike whole populations. Epidemics prompted not only public health measures, rudimentary as they were, but massive ritual appeasement campaigns. Temples filled, priests marched, people sacrificed animals in quantities that would alarm any modern veterinarian. The logic was clear. Epidemics didn't require doctors, they required diplomacy. And yet, for all the fear, there was an odd practicality embedded in Roman thinking. Illness as divine punishment meant there was a cause, even if you didn't know it. And if there was a cause, there was a chance to fix it. Through offerings, ceremonies, processions, vows, fasting, or any number of ritual acts meant to smooth over celestial tempers. This gave sickness an emotional complexity far beyond physical pain. Suffering didn't isolate Romans, it mobilized them. Families scrambled to soothe the unseen forces behind the symptoms. Communities rallied, not to bring soup, but to perform collective rites. People didn't just fear the disease, they feared misunderstanding its message. This is what made Roman illness so psychologically heavy. The pain you felt wasn't the only pain you carried. You also bore the weight of interpretation, responsibility, and the crushing suspicion that your fever wasn't a problem, it was an accusation. Modern medicine asks, what's wrong with the body? Roman religion asked, what's wrong with us? And until that question was answered, no remedy, not even the best physicians Rome had, felt truly secure. Because in Rome, the body didn't simply fail, it communicated. And the gods were the authors, whether you liked their message or not. For an ordinary Roman, calling a doctor was never a guarantee of survival. It was closer to placing a hopeful bet in a cosmic lottery where the gods controlled the winning numbers. Roman medicine had its tools, its theories, and its professionals, but none of them operated independently from divine oversight. A doctor might diagnose, treat, and reassure, but everyone understood one fundamental truth: the gods had veto power. Healing wasn't a science, it wasn't even an art, it was a negotiation, and the physician was only one voice in the room. The gods were the final judges. Roman doctors varied widely in skill. Some were well-trained, using Greek medical knowledge, herbs, diets, and rudimentary surgeries. Others were charlatans, improvising treatments with confidence far exceeding their competence. But even the best doctors knew their place in the cosmic hierarchy. They could stitch wounds, set bones, or balance humours, but they could not override divine intentions. If the gods wanted a person to recover, the simplest treatment might miraculously work. If the gods wanted someone to suffer or learn a lesson, the finest medical expertise in the empire wouldn't save them. This made healing a strange and delicate collaboration, a three-way relationship between patient, doctor, and deity. Physicians might prescribe poultices, herbs, baths, or dietary changes, but they also encouraged offerings at temples, prayers, or participation in rituals meant to soften divine resistance. Good medical practice was never purely physical. It included diplomacy with the unseen. For Romans, the unpredictability of illness meant that medicine was a gamble. Treatments weren't evaluated in the modern way through cause and effect or clinical results. They were evaluated by outcome alone. If someone got better, the doctor had done well, and the gods had approved. If someone got worse, either the disease was stronger than expected, the treatment was inadequate, or, most likely, the gods had simply not signed off on recovery. This divine veto power created immense psychological pressure for patients. Even if they trusted their physician, they couldn't fully commit to optimism. Hope was shadowed by the knowledge that the gods might have other plans. Healing required more than swallowing bitter medicine. It required maintaining spiritual correctness. A person might lie in bed worrying less about the fever in their body, and more about whether they had offended a deity whose name they'd forgotten to pronounce correctly. Doctors, for their part, tried to navigate this spiritual terrain tactfully. Many incorporated rituals into their treatments, not because they doubted their knowledge, but because they knew patients expected divine involvement. Some physicians wore amulets, invoked healing gods, or timed procedures according to favourable omens. A doctor who ignored divine context wasn't considered brave, they were considered reckless. Medicine in Rome wasn't separate from religion, it was woven into it, and this meant outcomes were never predictable. A simple wound might become infected, and the family would agonize over what divine message the festering injury conveyed. A severe illness might suddenly break after a night of prayer, leading everyone to conclude that the gods had changed their minds. A child hovering on the brink of death might recover after being taken to the temple of Aesculapius, and the doctor, no matter how talented, would receive far less credit than the god whose statue towered above the sanctuary. This lack of medical certainty shaped Roman culture's emotional resilience. People learned to accept ambiguous causation. The doctor tried, the gods decided. It wasn't fatalism, it was realism as they understood it. Trusting medicine alone felt naive. Trusting the gods alone felt irresponsible. Survival required both. Yet this system also placed doctors in a precarious position. If a treatment succeeded, the gods had blessed the effort. If it failed, the doctor could be blamed for angering the gods or missing some spiritual component of the illness. Physicians were expected to maintain not only medical skill, but ritual awareness. A smart doctor learned quickly that success kept their reputation intact, but failure could make patients suspicious of their competence or, worse, their piety. For the ordinary Roman patient, this meant healing required strategy. You followed the doctor's instructions, and you made offerings. You rested your body, and you purified your household shrine. You drank herbal concoctions, and you lit incense. You didn't hope the medicine worked. You hoped the gods permitted the medicine to work. And if recovery finally came, it was never attributed to a single cause. The doctor had done well. The patient had obeyed instructions. The family had demonstrated proper devotion, and most importantly, the gods had allowed it. Illness in Rome was never simply a physical event. It was a spiritual negotiation in which the body served as a battlefield. Doctors fought with herbs and a knowledge. Patients fought with strength and will. But the gods decided when and if the battle ended. Treatment helped, but the gods healed or didn't. For an ordinary Roman, nothing revealed the psychology of their world quite like a public disaster. A fire sweeping through an apartment block, a sudden flood drowning the marketplace, an earthquake rattling temples and toppling statues. These weren't treated as accidents or natural misfortunes. They were verdicts delivered dramatically and often without warning. When disaster struck Rome, people didn't ask what went wrong with the infrastructure, they asked what went wrong with them. In a culture where the gods were everywhere and easily offended, a catastrophe wasn't nature misbehaving, it was divine reproach made visible. And the more dramatic the disaster, the more personal the guilt felt. Picture a crowded Roman street moments after an earthquake. Dust rising, roof tiles scattered, people shouting, and beneath the chaos, a quieter panic humming through the crowd who messed up. Romans lived with the unsettling belief that the gods rarely punished individuals in isolation. They preferred large gestures, city-wide statements, public warnings, sweeping corrections of moral or ritual failings, which meant when the earth shook, everyone wondered whether they were the target. A disaster didn't just destroy property, it detonated the collective psyche. This created a cultural reflex, private guilt triggered by public chaos. If your neighbour's wall collapsed, you didn't immediately blame poor construction. You blamed a ritual performed incorrectly, maybe not even by the homeowner. Perhaps a priest had stumbled during a ceremony. Perhaps someone had ignored a festival. Perhaps an offering had been rushed, a prayer mispronounced, or a household god neglected. And perhaps, just perhaps, you yourself had forgotten something trivial but spiritually essential. This produced a remarkable mix of fear and introspection. Romans didn't wait for officials to explain a disaster. Explanations were automatic. A fire meant divine anger. A flood meant divine warning. An earthquake meant divine intervention. A storm destroying crops meant divine judgment. And because divine emotions were believed to be intricate and easily tipped off balance, people scanned their memories for signs of personal fault, the way modern people retrace steps looking for lost keys. The most unsettling part was that disasters rarely clarified anything. The gods didn't write explanatory notes. They didn't say whose error caused the damage or what needed to be fixed. They simply acted and left humans to interpret the fallout. This lack of clarity led to a society deeply invested in self-surveillance. Not government surveillance, divine surveillance. People monitored their own behaviour, not out of moral concern, but out of risk management. If the city burned, you didn't assume innocence. You assumed responsibility until proven otherwise. Public tragedies triggered an emotional domino effect. Families who had forgotten offerings suddenly rushed to shrines. People who had been lazy about domestic rituals scrambled to clean and refresh their household altars. Priests found their temples crowded with anxious citizens desperate to undo whatever cosmic mistake had been made, whether theirs or someone else's. The Roman instinct wasn't, why did this happen? It was, how do we fix it before it gets worse? This is why disasters often led to mass rituals, emergency sacrifices, and citywide purification ceremonies. These weren't gestures of mourning, they were damage control. If an earthquake toppled a temple roof, the city didn't rebuild first. They appeased the gods first. The rebuilding could wait. Placating divine anger could not. There was also a dark psychological twist. Disasters not only produced private guilt, they produced public suspicion. If a fire broke out in a neighbourhood, known for neglecting certain rituals, people whispered. If a flood hit a district whose temple had recently fallen into disrepair, citizens exchanged knowing looks. If lightning struck a building associated with a controversial figure, the gossip was immediate. Romans didn't merely interpret disasters, they interpreted the patterns around disasters. Divine punishment had to be aimed at someone, and while individuals felt guilt, communities often tried to identify culprits. A careless priest, an impious official, a family rumoured to have offended a household deity. Someone had caused the gods irritation, and the city paid the price. This collective blame culture didn't necessarily lead to violence, but it did lead to heightened spiritual paranoia. Disaster turned everyone into an investigator, hunting for invisible mistakes and unspoken sins. You never wanted to be the person whose forgetfulness became the reason the Tiber overflowed. And yet strangely, this fear also unified people. Public disasters bound Romans together in a shared urgency. Rituals became collective therapy sessions. Offerings multiplied. Temples flooded with anxious families, not because they all understood what went wrong, but because none of them did, and that uncertainty was the real terror. For the average Roman, the lesson was clear. Private mistakes had public consequences. Public disasters had private implications, and the gods preferred communicating in large, destructive gestures rather than quiet whispers. When the city burned, the question wasn't what happened, it was who had misstepped. And as everyone sifted through ashes or bailed out water, their thoughts turned inward with the same heavy dread. Was it me? For an ordinary Roman, danger didn't always come from dramatic mistakes, shattered jugs, mispronounced prayers, or ominous omens streaking across the sky. Sometimes danger came from the quiet moments, the overlooked ones, the ones where you didn't do anything wrong, but also didn't do anything right. In Rome, inactivity carried its own kind of peril. The gods could be offended simply because you failed to acknowledge them. Silence, in the Roman worldview, wasn't emptiness, it was neglect. Modern people think of forgetting as harmless, even understandable. Romans did not. Forgetting to perform a ritual wasn't a minor error. It was a breach of cosmic etiquette. Imagine having dozens of birthdays to remember, but instead of disappointed friends, you had gods who could punish the entire household for your absent-mindedness. Neglect wasn't benign, it was dangerous. The Romans believed the gods thrived on attention, offerings, and ritual consistency. The divine world wasn't passive, it was reactive. And if humans stopped performing the rituals that maintained the relationship, the gods didn't drift away. They leaned in, hard. The relationship between mortals and immortals had no neutral setting. It functioned only through deliberate action. Not praying wasn't spiritually empty. It was spiritually provocative. This meant an ordinary Roman lived with a nagging daily anxiety. What have I forgotten? And that anxiety wasn't exaggerated. Roman religious life was crowded with ceremonies, daily, monthly, seasonal, annual, and layered with private rituals, family duties, and citywide observations. There were offerings for household gods, spirits of the hearth, spirits of the doorway, spirits of the crossroads, spirits of the ancestors, and gods overseeing every stage of life from birth to death. Some rituals were simple, others involved multiple steps, spoken formulas, and carefully timed gestures. Missing even one could throw everything out of balance. The fear wasn't that the gods would misunderstand you. The fear was that they would understand exactly what you did not do. Neglect carried a distinct kind of guilt. Other mistakes were immediate. A clumsy slip of the tongue, a dropped offering, a ritual that had to be restarted. But neglect was subtle, invisible. You only discovered it afterward, when something went wrong. A business deal failed. A child fell ill. A fire broke out. Misfortune piled up. Only then did you realize that silence had been interpreted as disregard. Neglect was a spiritual danger precisely because it created ambiguity. You might have forgotten a ritual date. You might have overlooked a household god. You might have skipped a festival because you were busy or tired or simply distracted. And because you didn't notice at the time, you couldn't be sure what mistake to fix afterward. Romans hated ambiguity. To them, the divine world functioned like a complex machine, one that required constant maintenance. If you stopped oiling the gears, even by accident, the machine didn't slow gracefully. It jammed. And when it jammed, The consequences spilled into daily life. This created an unusual cultural behaviour: ritual redundancy. Romans often performed rituals just in case. If they weren't sure whether an offering had been made earlier in the week, they made another one. If they couldn't remember a prayer, they said it again. If something felt off, they acted preemptively. Doing nothing was more dangerous than doing something imperfectly. This is why Roman homes had multiple shrines, why festivals sometimes overlapped, and why priests developed long, elaborate ceremonies, layering actions so thoroughly that even the smallest hint of neglect could be drowned out by sheer ritual intensity. Better to do too much than too little. Better to speak too many words than risk being silent at the wrong moment. The fear of forgetting shaped daily routines. People repeated formulaic greetings to household gods in the morning and evening. They paused briefly at altars when they walked by. They carried small offerings in their pockets during certain times of year, in case they needed to make a spontaneous gesture of devotion. Even travel required precautionary prayers, because being away from home increased the chance of missing a scheduled ritual. For Romans, religious life wasn't dramatic, it was relentless. The gods weren't monsters waiting to pounce on minor infractions. They were cosmic administrators who required acknowledgement to keep the universe running smoothly. Silence wasn't rebellion, it was absence. And absence hinted at ingratitude, negligence, or disrespect. In a society obsessed with maintaining divine goodwill, failing to act was as dangerous as acting incorrectly. Ritual correctness mattered, yes, but ritual consistency mattered even more. And so the ordinary Roman carried a unique kind of burden, the fear that the gods might interpret their quiet as carelessness. You didn't have to commit a crime. You didn't have to insult a deity. You just had to forget to light a lamp, skip a prayer, or overlook a festival. Doing nothing was also a risk, because in Rome even silence made noise, and the gods were always listening. For an ordinary Roman, the true burden of religion wasn't fear of cosmic punishment, bad omens, or divine surveillance, though those were exhausting enough. The real strain came from the sheer volume of obligations. Rome didn't have a handful of gods you could honour at your convenience. Rome had a spiritual workforce so vast, it made your daily life feel like you were permanently behind on assignments for classes you never signed up for. Romans didn't worship the gods, they worshipped all the gods, known and unknown, major and minor, local and imported, personal and state-sanctioned. It was a full-time job layered on top of your actual full-time job, and somehow neither employer cared that the other existed. And so the Roman religious calendar wasn't a gentle guide to spiritual life. It was a bureaucratic avalanche. There were rituals every morning, offerings at night, festivals throughout the year, obligations tied to the household, obligations tied to the city, obligations tied to your job or guild, obligations tied to your ancestry, obligations tied to your neighbourhood, and obligations tied to whichever foreign gods had recently arrived and needed polite acknowledgement. Missing one didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like failing to complete paperwork that your immortal supervisors were definitely tracking. Everyone had responsibilities and no one had enough hours in the day. Take a typical Roman morning. Before breakfast you might greet the household gods, then you'd acknowledge the spirits of the doorway, then you'd step outside and pass a street shrine, another quick gesture required. Then maybe you'd see a procession forming for a festival you forgot was happening today, meaning you suddenly needed to participate or risk divine side-eye. By the time you arrived at work, you'd already performed more rituals than most modern people perform in a month, and those were just baseline tasks. Add in the monthly festivals, of which there were too many to name without sounding like you're reading tax codes. Add the agricultural rituals, the ancestral rites, the purification days, the oath-taking ceremonies, the seasonal offerings, and the sudden religious emergencies triggered by omens, comets, or a priest dropping something at a bad moment. The Roman calendar was so crowded that certain days weren't even permitted for regular activities because they were already booked by the gods. Imagine running your life around not just holidays, but do not conduct business days, where the reason was, essentially, the gods are busy today. Please respect their schedule, The pressure wasn't subtle. Failing to meet obligations didn't just put you at risk, it put your family, neighbours, and sometimes the entire city at risk. Religious negligence was a communal concern. If the person next to you fell behind on worship, you had to wonder if their missed ritual might accidentally invoke citywide misfortune. This produced an atmosphere where ritual compliance felt less like personal devotion and more like mandatory divine paperwork. Romans weren't free to choose which gods they favoured or which festivals they enjoyed. The system didn't care what they liked, it cared what they completed. Worship, therefore, became a form of labour, unpaid labour, performed under the constant pressure of knowing the universe had a very strict filing system. The gods didn't congratulate you for staying on top of it. They simply refrained from punishing you, which was the closest thing Romans ever got to divine praise, and the system kept expanding. Rome absorbed new cultures constantly, and with them came new gods. The empire wasn't exclusionary, it was accumulative. If a conquered culture had a god for something, Rome simply added that god to the list. This wasn't multicultural enthusiasm, it was spiritual risk management. Better to acknowledge a new deity than accidentally offend one you didn't know existed. For the ordinary Roman, this meant the list of divine obligations grew steadily across generations, like an ever-expanding to-do list curated by eternity itself. People tried to cope. Some families specialised, honouring certain gods more intensely. Some delegated duties among household members. Some leaned heavily on priests to perform rituals on their behalf. But delegation only solved so much. Even if you outsourced your major religious responsibilities, you still had dozens of minor rituals requiring your personal involvement. The feeling wasn't, I'm skipping worship today, it was, I am tragically, hopelessly behind. The emotional toll was enormous. It wasn't fear of punishment that wore people down, it was fatigue, the endless repetition, the memorization, the scheduling, the sudden realizations that today was a festival you forgot, or a purification day you missed, or a sacred time you accidentally violated by doing something as innocent as buying fish at the wrong hour. Even relaxation became suspicious. If you had free time, you had to ask yourself, did I forget something? And the answer almost always was yes. In the end, Romans didn't experience religion as a series of spiritual highs or emotional revelations. They experienced it as labour, the constant effort of keeping the divine machine oiled and functioning. The gods didn't need your faith. They needed your punctuality. And in Rome, failure wasn't dramatic rebellion. It was falling behind schedule. For an ordinary Roman, the scariest thing about the empire's constant expansion wasn't the wars, the taxes, or the occasional emperor who treated sanity as a seasonal hobby. The real fear was spiritual. Every time Rome conquered someone, it inherited their gods. Not symbolically, not politely, literally. Conquest meant acquisition of land, people, and divine responsibilities. And since Rome conquered a lot, the number of gods an ordinary citizen was expected to acknowledge ballooned like a cosmic to-do list with no delete button. Rome didn't believe in removing old gods to make room for new ones. That would have been risky. What if the old gods got offended? What if the new gods got offended? What if everyone got offended? It was safer, much, much safer to honour all of them. So instead of narrowing the spiritual field, Rome expanded it until the pantheon resembled an overcrowded apartment where every deity insisted on having their own shelf space, rituals, and annual maintenance fees. Foreign gods didn't simplify Roman religion. They multiplied the chaos. Every new culture Rome absorbed came with its own divine ecosystem. Deities of storms, deities of fertility, deities of roads, forests, healing, love, death, vengeance, childbirth, rivers, oceans, mountains, and occasionally deities whose purpose was unclear even to their original worshippers. Rome welcomed all of them with nervous enthusiasm, because the alternative, ignoring them, felt like poking a sleeping monster. The logic was simple. If a foreign god had proven powerful enough to survive somewhere else, ignoring it in Rome could trigger cosmic retaliation. Better to offer a ritual than gamble with the unknown. And so the spiritual burden on ordinary Romans grew heavier with every Roman victory. Egypt, say hello to Isis and Serapis. Gaul, meet Epona, goddess of horses, now added to your morning prayer rotation. Persia, Mithras reporting for duty. Please adjust your evening rituals accordingly. Asia Minor, Cybele has arrived with rituals loud enough to shake apartment walls. Rome didn't curate its religious collection, it swallowed everything whole. This led to a strange spiritual inflation. Every time the empire expanded, daily life became more complicated. New gods meant new expectations, new rituals, new festivals, and new fears. People barely kept up with the gods they already had. Now they had to worry about whether some Phrygian earth goddess they had never heard of might punish them for improper acknowledgement. The stress wasn't just about time, it was about ignorance. How could you avoid offending a god whose preferences, stories, and rituals you didn't even know? It's navigated this with a uniquely Roman solution. Assume everything is sacred until proven otherwise. Foreign temples, offer something. Strange statue at the market, nod respectfully. Unfamiliar procession blocking the street, join in just in case. Superstitions ballooned accordingly. Symbols, gestures, objects, anything visually associated with a foreign deity gained weight. You might not understand the ritual, but you understood risk. The empire was full of gods with long memories and short tempers. Ordinary Romans learned to accommodate them, even if they didn't fully believe in all of them. Belief wasn't required. Compliance was. Roman politicians took advantage of this divine expansion. Associating themselves with foreign gods could strengthen their power, unify populations, or intimidate rivals. But for ordinary citizens, each political decision meant another layer of spiritual anxiety. If the state declared a foreign god officially recognized, you suddenly had one more cosmic entity to consider before making a simple decision, like leaving your house. Foreign gods didn't replace local fears, they stacked on top of them. The result was a society where religious caution multiplied like rabbits. Until a Roman walking through the city was performing micro-rituals constantly, out of habit, fear, or both. And some imported gods were loud, literally. The cult of Cybele, for instance, arrived in Rome with cymbals, drums, wild dances, and rituals that made household worship look like quiet library reading. Ordinary residents had to adjust to the idea that divine expectations now included noise levels capable of startling livestock. Others required secrecy. Mithras, worshipped in chores and underground chambers, added a layer of mystery that made Romans nervous. If a god demanded secrecy, what happened if you accidentally violated a rule you didn't know existed? Still others were deeply comforting to their followers, but confusing to everyone else. Isis, beloved by many, came with symbolic rituals that ordinary Italians struggled to interpret. Yet failing to respect her influence felt foolish. Better to play along than risk divine offence. Rome's multicultural empire turned the spiritual landscape into a maze of gods with overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting traditions, and unpredictable requirements. A modern person might feel overwhelmed managing multiple apps and passwords. A Roman felt overwhelmed managing multiple gods and rituals, each with existential consequences. This spiritual overload produced a unique cultural anxiety, the fear of incomplete devotion. You weren't terrified of one god, you were terrified of missing one god. The divine world became a crowded room where you had to make eye contact with everyone so no one felt ignored. Rome didn't replace gods, it collected them. And the ordinary Roman paid the interest. For an ordinary Roman, religious festivals were the closest thing life offered to freedom. Brief, glittering windows where fear relaxed its grip. Laughter returned to public streets. Wine flowed like water. And people actually allowed themselves to enjoy being alive. Festivals were Rome's built-in pressure valves, designed to release the mounting tension of living under constant divine surveillance. But as every Roman knew all too well, the gods never took the day off, and their presence hummed beneath every drumbeat, every dance, every toast. Festivals weren't vacations. They were officially scheduled moments of sanctioned joy, joy carefully supervised by the very beings whose judgment shaped daily life. At first glance, festivals seemed like pure celebration. The city transformed, streets filled with garlands, vendors, musicians, and crowds dressed in vivid colours. Processions wound through Rome, led by priests in immaculate robes. Animals decorated with ribbons marched toward altars. Temples flew banners. Even the air smelled different, of incense, flowers, cooked meat, and the rare sensation of optimism. For ordinary people, these days were precious. Household routines paused. Work obligations eased. Meals were shared openly. Children ran freely through streets normally too crowded or dangerous for play. Elders told stories. Young people flirted under torchlight. Rome became for a moment a city without burdens. But beneath the laughter and celebration, everyone understood the deeper truth. A festival was not an escape from divine power. It was a performance for it. Every festival was designed not for human enjoyment, but for divine satisfaction. The joy was real, yes, but it existed because pleasing the gods required demonstrating communal harmony. Romans weren't partying for themselves. They were partying to show the gods that Rome was grateful, united, obedient, and aware of its cosmic place. The festival wasn't just a celebration, it was a report card. This dual purpose created a strange emotional balance. People danced, but they danced correctly. People sang, but they sang hymns prescribed generations earlier. Even jokes had boundaries. Too bold and you risked irreverence, too tame and you seemed ungrateful. Festivals demanded enthusiasm without impropriety, joy without arrogance, indulgence without disrespect. In a sense, the gods were the guests of honour, and Romans were the hosts, nervously hoping their celestial audience approved of the show. This is why festivals were so heavily ritualised. Every procession had a set path, every sacrifice had a precise moment, every chant had a specific wording, every offering had to be prepared exactly right. If anything went wrong, a priest stumbled, an animal resisted, a ritual tool fell, a flute player missed a note. The entire ceremony could be invalidated. The joy instantly paused, replaced by dread. A flawed ritual meant the gods hadn't accepted the offering and the festival's purpose had failed. And then the celebration became emergency damage control. But when festivals went well, the emotional release was spectacular. Romans experienced collective joy in a way modern cities rarely do. Barriers between social classes softened. Slaves were given partial freedom, masters loosened their authority. In some festivals, like Saturnalia, the entire social hierarchy temporarily inverted. Slaves sat at tables while their masters served them. A ritualized reversal meant to acknowledge and relieve long-simmering tensions. And yet, even Saturnalia, the most free-spirited, chaotic, vibrant festival of the year, carried the unmistakable fragrance of divine oversight. The inversion wasn't rebellion, it was ritual. A controlled chaos permitted for a few days so the gods could see that Rome recognized the balance between freedom and order. The moment the festival ended, everything snapped back to normal. The party didn't last. The fear returned quietly. The gods, after their brief entertainment, resumed their watch. But perhaps the strangest emotional twist was that festivals intensified the awareness of divine presence. When the streets erupted into celebration, people felt the gods more strongly, not less. The bright decorations, the temple ceremonies, the sacrifices, the music, these weren't distractions. They were reminders, visually stunning reminders that Rome's joy only existed when the gods allowed it. Ordinary Romans often felt a quiet melancholy at the end of festivals, not because the fun was over, but because they were re-entering a world where joy was conditional. It was one thing to live under divine supervision, it was another to taste freedom and then hand it back politely. The pressure didn't lift after the festivals, it reset. People returned to work the next day aware they had obligations to catch up on. Rituals postponed, tasks delayed, responsibilities waiting. The gods had been honoured, yes, but that didn't erase the daily requirements of worship. The festival was a pause, not forgiveness. In the end, festivals taught Romans an uncomfortable truth. Even their happiness belonged to the gods. They could celebrate, they could feast, they could let themselves relax for a moment. But the divine presence remained constant, even during joy. The party ended, the garlands wilted, the wine pots emptied, and the gods didn't. If being an adult in ancient Rome meant living under the crushing weight of divine expectations, being a child meant growing up inside that pressure from the moment you could walk, speak, or accidentally touch something sacred with sticky fingers. Roman children did not slowly ease into religious awareness the way modern children ease into school rules. They were born into spiritual responsibility, and their earliest lessons weren't about colours, numbers, or animals. They were about the gods, and what happened if you forgot to respect them. Fear was not an unfortunate byproduct of childhood. Fear was part of the curriculum. Modern parents have bedtime stories about brave heroes or talking animals. Roman parents had bedtime stories about what happens when you offend Jupiter, or when you neglect a household rite, or when you walk past a shrine without nodding. These stories weren't entertainment. They were early warning systems. A Roman lullaby wasn't meant to soothe a child into sleep. It was meant to prevent the child from growing into someone whose carelessness caused divine retaliation before breakfast. And so, Roman childhood blended innocence with constant supervision from both adults and the unseen residents of the cosmos. One of the first things a child learned was that the gods were watching all the time, everywhere, especially at home where the Lares and Penaces kept close track of family behaviour. A child who spilled food during a household ritual might be gently corrected, but the correction always came with the same message. The gods saw that. And because the gods were not imagined as warm or forgiving, but as meticulous and occasionally irritable, the child internalized this truth early. Mistakes weren't private. Mistakes mattered. Parents used divine consequences the way modern parents use timeouts. Except instead of spending 10 minutes in a corner, a Roman child learned that a forgotten offering could lead to sickness, or a disrespected shrine could lead to household misfortune. Fear wasn't cruelty, it was preventative education. Children learned rituals by performing them. Toddlers watched their parents light incense at the hearth. Young children practiced small gestures, placing a bit of bread, bowing, reciting tiny fragments of memorized prayers. Older children helped with household ceremonies, each movement carefully supervised. Learning rituals wasn't optional. It was as essential as learning to speak. A child who didn't know the proper way to honour the gods wasn't just ignorant. They were dangerous. Because in Rome, ignorance could doom the family. Imagine being 6 years old and told that missing a single word in a ritual could make the gods upset. Imagine being 9 and discovering you were responsible for saluting household shrines before leaving the house. Imagine being 12 and learning that your first spilled offering wasn't an accident but a sign, and therefore required doing the whole thing again, properly this time with everyone watching. Roman children didn't simply imitate adult behaviour. They absorbed adult anxiety. Even harmless play carried spiritual implications. Running through a doorway without acknowledging the threshold spirit. Bad idea. Playing too loudly near the household shrine. Not respectful, accidentally knocking over a small offering. That needed immediate correction. The games children played had invisible boundaries. Don't cross this spot, don't shout here, don't run past that shrine, don't touch anything that looks vaguely ceremonial. And because Roman religion was everywhere, the opportunities to accidentally offend a deity were endless. Parents knew this. And so they compensated by shaping children through a mix of affection, discipline, and divine warnings. Not because they wanted fearful children, but because fear was a survival skill. A child who learned fear early became an adult who performed rituals correctly, remembered festivals, respected omens, and helped keep the household and the city safe. Public life reinforced these lessons. Children attended festivals, ceremonies, sacrifices, and processions, not for entertainment but for cultural training. They watched priests perform intricate rituals. They saw animals sacrificed with solemnity. They heard the crowd fall silent during sacred moments. They experienced the weight of divine presence long before they understood the political or social meaning behind it. Even education was infused with divine oversight. Children learned to read by reciting texts connected to religion. They learned to count while helping prepare offerings. They learned discipline through rituals that demanded stillness and precision. If they failed, adults didn't simply scold them. They explained the cosmic implications. For a Roman child, the world was full of unseen forces whose approval determined safety, health, and prosperity. Heaven wasn't far away. It was in the walls, the hearth, the fields, the sky, the streets. A misstep at any moment could ripple upward and outward. Growing up meant learning the choreography of survival, steps practiced daily, with mistakes corrected swiftly before they accumulated into divine irritation. Yet despite all this fear, Roman children didn't grow up miserable. Fear wasn't constant terror, it was background logic. Children laughed, played, joked, and formed friendships. They enjoyed festivals, followed parades, and stole treats when adults weren't looking. Childhood joy existed, but always with the understanding that the gods were watching, and joy was allowed only because the household had maintained divine favour. The emotional tone was a blend Romans never questioned. Playful curiosity carefully wrapped in cosmic caution. Children ran through life knowing their world was bigger than they were, and that the beings bigger than the world demanded attention, respect, and correctness. A Roman child didn't fall asleep dreaming of monsters. They fell asleep remembering that monsters were fictional, but the gods were real. Because in Rome, even bedtime stories came with consequences. If ordinary Romans lived under constant divine scrutiny, enslaved Romans lived under two layers of surveillance, one human, one supernatural. Their world was shaped by obedience not only to the person who owned their body, but also to the household gods who monitored the home in ways no human overseer ever could. Fear for them wasn't occasional. It was a permanent condition, woven into every movement, every task, every breath. Enslaved people in Rome had no legal autonomy, no guaranteed rights, and no power to negotiate their position. But what made their life even more psychologically suffocating was that they occupied a spiritual environment not of their own choosing. They were expected to honour the gods of the household, participate in rituals for deities they did not select, and take responsibility for maintaining divine order in a place where even minor ritual failure could lead to punishment, whether human or divine. You weren't just someone's property, you were someone's property inside someone else's sacred space. The enslaved lived in constant proximity to the lares and penates, the household gods whose watchful presence defined the emotional landscape of the home. But for slaves, these gods were both familiar and alien. They offered no comfort. They weren't protectors. They were guardians of a system that enslaved people had been forced into. The gods favoured the household, not the individuals within it. And that meant the enslaved lived inside a spiritual hierarchy just as rigid as the social one. If the household angered the gods through a ritual mistake, improper offering, or forgotten festival, enslaved people suffered the consequences alongside everyone else, but with fewer ways to protect themselves. They couldn't choose rituals, they couldn't request atonements, they couldn't question the religious practices of the family. They just followed orders and hoped the gods accepted the actions of those in charge. Their survival depended on the competence and piety of their masters, and this led to a twisted emotional dynamic. The enslaved learned to fear their masters' mistakes almost as much as their own. A household with sloppy religious habits was a dangerous place to live. People who neglected offerings, rushed prayers, or ignored omens risked inviting divine displeasure that affected everyone under their roof. But only enslaved people could be punished twice for the same mistake, once by the gods and once by the angry master who interpreted misfortune as a sign that someone in the household had behaved incorrectly. The enslaved became convenient scapegoats for divine messages. If a fire broke out, a jar shattered, or food spoiled unexpectedly, a master might decide that a slave had offended the household gods. Evidence wasn't required. Suspicion was enough. People already living at the bottom of society were the easiest to blame, and divine accountability offered a frightening justification for cruelty. Yet the enslaved also bore religious responsibilities they could not refuse. They lit the hearth fires. They prepared offerings, they cleaned altars, they carried sacred objects during rituals, they organized festival preparations, they decorated doorways for holy days, they assisted priests during domestic ceremonies. This meant that enslaved people lived with the constant fear of accidentally disrupting a ritual, not because they feared personal failure, but because such a mistake could bring wrath upon the entire household. They were expected to uphold divine order while receiving none of the spiritual honor that Roman citizens claimed for themselves. Obedience to gods and masters blended together in a suffocating way. You didn't just answer to the person who gave you orders, you answered to the invisible beings who judged how well you carried them out. Even the possibility of conversion or personal belief was complicated. Enslaved people came from every corner of the empire: Greece, Syria, Gaul, North Africa, Anatolia, Judea, each with their own gods, traditions, and sacred stories. But when they entered a Roman household, they had to adopt the religious routines of that home. The gods they once honoured became distant, unreachable, sometimes even dangerous to mention. Their spiritual identity was overwritten by the expectations of the family that owned them. Some found ways to blend their own beliefs with Roman practices. Others clung to private rituals when no one was looking. But many simply learned to survive in a world where every ritual was a performance, every mistake a threat, and every day brought new opportunities to be blamed for divine misfortune. And because enslaved people were often the ones managing domestic tasks, they were the first to encounter problematic omens, strange noises, broken objects, malfunctioning lamps, spilled offerings. They absorbed these signs silently because reacting visibly could draw unwanted suspicion. To be a slave in Rome was to notice everything and comment on nothing. The psychological toll was immense. Living under one authority crushes autonomy. Living under two crushes identity. You were never just performing your job, you were performing your role in a cosmic system designed without your consent. If you pleased your master but displeased the gods, you suffered. If you pleased the gods but displeased your master, you also suffered. The enslaved existed in a world where the boundaries between human control and divine control blurred into a single, unyielding pressure, one that defined every moment of their lives. Freedom was unimaginable, safety was unstable, and faith for many became something quietly held, secretly nourished, or painfully abandoned. Because in Rome, being enslaved meant you answered to your owner, and his gods watched you too. For an ordinary Roman soldier, marching into battle wasn't the frightening part. Romans trained for combat. They knew how to take orders, hold formation, and swing a sword with terrifying discipline. What truly haunted them wasn't the enemy in front of them. It was the invisible force behind them, the gods. The same cosmic supervisors who monitored household rituals and public ceremonies also oversaw the battlefield, and their opinion mattered far more than the skill of the opposing army. War in Rome wasn't merely a contest of strength or strategy, it was a ritual gamble. Every campaign requiring divine permission. Soldiers didn't fear defeat as much as they feared fighting without the gods' blessing. A battle fought in divine disfavor wasn't a battle, it was a punishment waiting to happen. Roman military life began with ritual, offerings to Mars, Minerva, and other war gods, prayers for protection, observations of omens, inspections of sacred animals. This wasn't ceremony for morale, it was survival strategy. If the gods withdrew support, even the greatest general would fail. And if the gods approved, even a ragged legion could perform miracles. This deep dependence on divine will shaped the emotional environment of Roman soldiers. Courage mattered, yes, but obedience to ritual mattered more. A man could be brave, skilled, and loyal, yet still doomed if the augurs announced unfavourable signs. Being a soldier meant accepting that your life didn't belong entirely to you. It belonged to the gods, and they could decide whether you lived or died long before swords ever clashed. Nowhere was this clearer than in the army's obsession with omens. The same birds that controlled civic life also influenced the fates of legions. But while ordinary citizens merely had to adjust appointments around pigeons, soldiers faced far higher stakes. A single unlucky omen, an eagle flying the wrong direction, a raven landing ominously, a sudden gust of wind, could delay a march, postpone a battle, or force an entire army to reroute. War was unpredictable enough without adding a spiritual audit every morning. And yet the most infamous military omen involved creatures far less majestic than eagles or ravens, sacred chickens. Carried on campaign inside cages, these birds held the power to greenlight battles. Before a campaign or major engagement, the chickens were offered grain. If they pecked enthusiastically, the army rejoiced. The gods approved. If they barely touched the grain, soldiers grew nervous. If they refused entirely, the message was unmistakable. Do not fight. Imagine thousands of hardened soldiers, armed and ready, pacing nervously while a priest stared at a chicken, refusing to eat. Your sword could be sharp, your training flawless, your morale high, but everything depended on the appetite of a bird. And soldiers respected the ritual. They understood its significance. They wanted divine assurance before risking their lives. But they also carried the fear that a single mistake, committed not by them but by a priest, a commander, or even the chickens, could doom the entire legion. War was a group project where everyone suffered for collective ritual errors. If a commander ignored the omens, soldiers didn't admire his bravery. They worried they were about to die pointlessly. One of the most famous disasters in Roman military history occurred when a commander, Publius Claudius Pulcher, mocked the sacred chickens. When they refused to eat, he joked, "If they won't eat, let them drink," and threw them into the sea. His army was annihilated. The message was clear: enemies might forgive an error. The gods never did. Beyond omens, soldiers also feared the possibility that they themselves might offend the gods during a campaign. Travel, poor conditions, long marches, and unfamiliar lands all increased the risk of neglecting ritual duties. A soldier who forgot a personal offering might feel responsible for the next day's misfortune. A man who stumbled during a sacred moment or misspoke a prayer might suspect he had invited danger onto the entire legion. And the battlefield compounds fear with adrenaline. Before charging, soldiers knew the gods were watching, not symbolically, but actively. Every clash of shields, every scream, every dust cloud rising into the hot air of a foreign plane carried spiritual weight. Romans believed the gods weren't neutral observers. They participated. Mars might strengthen them or abandon them. Victory wasn't earned. It was granted. This worldview meant Roman soldiers marched with two enemies, the human one they could see and the divine one whose displeasure was invisible but far more fatal. The psychological burden was immense. Soldiers feared cowardice, yes, but cowardice had human consequences. Defying omens had cosmic ones. Blow from an enemy could miss. A divine blow never did. Even after battles ended, the fear lingered. Victory demanded rituals of gratitude. Defeat demanded rituals of atonement. Soldiers who survived had to cleanse themselves spiritually, not just physically. The battlefield wasn't just bloody. It was spiritually contaminated until proper ceremonies restored balance. For a Roman soldier, bravery wasn't the absence of fear. Bravery was fighting while knowing the gods had the power to undo every plan, every formation, every heartbeat. Your training protected you from the enemy. Your discipline protected your legion. But only the gods protected your life, and they could withdraw that protection at any moment. The enemy could miss. The gods never did. For ordinary Romans, the most unnerving fact about the gods wasn't their power, their temper, or even their willingness to punish entire cities for one person's mistake. The most terrifying thing was much simpler. The gods never explained themselves. They did not clarify omens, correct misunderstandings, or provide follow-up messages. Their communication style ranged from cryptic to non-existent, and their silence was often more frightening than their thunder. Divine ambiguity shaped Roman life more than any temple, festival, or priest ever could. A Roman didn't expect the gods to speak plainly. They expected the gods to send signs, ambiguous, symbol-heavy, easily misinterpreted signs, and then withdraw, leaving humans to interpret the message while hoping they hadn't made everything worse. The gods offered the ancient equivalent of a vague text message. We need to talk, and then refused to elaborate. This meant every unanswered question, every quiet moment, every uneventful day carried spiritual tension. Was silence approval? Or was silence the warning before the storm? Romans leaned toward the second option. In a worldview saturated with divine oversight, the absence of signs wasn't comforting, it was suspicious. Something might be wrong, very wrong, and the gods simply hadn't revealed the consequences yet. The future hung over the present like a closed door you were afraid to open. And because the gods didn't clarify, humans filled the silence with guesses, interpretations, theories, fears. 1,000 possible meanings swirled around a single unresolved moment. An uneasy stomach, a quiet temple, a dream cut short. A festival that felt a little off. Everything became an invitation to speculate. Romans were experts at decoding nothing into something. Silence wasn't neutral. It was loaded. This uncertainty shaped how Romans approached rituals. If a ceremony felt too smooth, too quiet, or too easy, people worried they had missed something. If a priest performed every step perfectly, but the atmosphere felt strange, people whispered. If a festival concluded without any notable sign, people wondered whether the gods had accepted it or simply withheld judgment. The fear wasn't that the gods refused your offering, the fear was that they didn't bother responding at all. In Rome, gods didn't need to shout. Silence was louder. This ambiguity also affected personal decisions. A Roman might pray for guidance before a journey, marriage, business deal, or legal dispute. If they received a sign, great. If they received a bad sign, unfortunate, but at least it was information. But most of the time, nothing, no dream, no omen, no symbolic bird flying in a helpful direction, just quiet. And quiet was the worst outcome. It forced people to decide without knowing whether the gods approved. This made every choice feel like a test with invisible grading. Even mundane actions like buying a mule or digging a well could trigger spirals of uncertainty. Romans lived with the constant suspicion that their decisions might land on the wrong side of divine preference. Because silence didn't mean yes. Silence meant figure it out and hope you're not wrong. Romans didn't cope well with this uncertainty. They consulted priests, augurs, astrologers, dream interpreters, wise elders, and anyone rumoured to have insight into divine patterns. A person who claimed to interpret subtle divine hints became valuable, sometimes suspiciously so. The desire to understand the god's silence led to a flourishing interpretive culture, but also to manipulation. Ambiguity opened doors for opportunists, charlatans, and self-appointed experts. But ordinary Romans didn't have the luxury of ignoring these voices. When the gods refused to explain themselves, you listened to whoever did, or claimed they did. Silence made even questionable advice feel necessary. And the silence wasn't only about rituals or decisions, it invaded emotional life too. If something good happened unexpectedly, a child recovered from illness, a business deal prospered, a soldier returned unharmed, Romans didn't assume they were blessed. They assumed the gods had reasons, and those reasons were unknowable. Happiness wasn't pure. It came with an undertone of, enjoy this while it lasts. The unpredictability of divine silence also shaped Roman humility. People didn't brag about success. That would draw attention, from humans and gods alike. Pride risked provoking divine correction, and since the gods rarely commented directly, their correction usually arrived disguised as misfortune. A stone falling from a roof, a sudden fever, a missed opportunity. Silence turned even good luck into something you handled cautiously. This ambiguity also influenced Roman art, literature, and philosophy. Thinkers debated the gods endlessly. Were they visible? Were they consistent? Did they care? Did they punish everyone equally? Did they communicate only through signs? Or was the entire system incomprehensible by design? Ordinary Romans didn't have time for such debates. They simply lived inside the uncertainty. They operated under the assumption that the gods perceived everything, revealed very little, and expected humans to maintain the relationship without ever receiving clear instructions. Imagine living your entire life based on rules you never fully understood, designed by beings who never explained their intentions, enforced by signs that might or might not mean what you thought they meant. Imagine a world where the silence of heaven was louder than thunder. For Romans, this wasn't imagination. It was their daily reality. No answer didn't mean yes. It didn't even mean maybe. It meant they were still watching, and you would find out the meaning eventually, whether you liked it or not. For the ordinary Roman, religion didn't feel like a warm blanket wrapped around the soul. It felt like a tight belt you had to keep adjusting every hour so it wouldn't cut off circulation. Living correctly, ritually, spiritually, behaviourally was a full-time occupation layered on top of your actual full-time occupation. It demanded constant vigilance, constant awareness, constant correction, and no matter how much effort you put in, there was no sense of completion. You didn't finish being religious. You simply tried to keep up. In Rome, faith wasn't an inner feeling. It was a schedule, a checklist, a set of duties that expanded with every generation, every conquest, every priestly update. Piety was measured not in devotion but in performance, and performance required energy Rome's people never really had to spare. Ordinary Romans woke up tired. Not physically tired, though hauling water, farming hillsides and working workshops didn't help, but spiritually tired. The moment they opened their eyes, obligations started piling onto the day. Greet the household gods, check the hearth, avoid omens, remember the festival date. Leave the house with appropriate gestures. Keep an eye out for anything odd. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't not say the right thing. Don't offend the unseen. Don't forget to remember. Other cultures feared the gods for their might. Rome feared the gods for their meticulousness. And meticulousness is exhausting. The emotional burden wasn't driven by dramatic divine punishments, though those were terrifying. It was driven by the dozens of tiny, constant tasks necessary to keep the world functioning. A Roman didn't feel spiritually uplifted when performing a ritual. They felt relieved, the way someone feels after paying a bill on time. Religion wasn't a source of peace. It was a form of cosmic housekeeping. Every ritual you performed held your life together. Every ritual you forgot threatened to pull it apart. This turned daily existence into a slow drain on the mind. Romans spoke frequently of pietas, the duty to uphold religious and social order. But no one talked about religious fatigue, though it was everywhere. People learned to hide it, swallow it, disguise it as diligence. But exhaustion leaked through in small ways. People snapping at each other during festivals, dragging their feet to ceremonies, whispering complaints about overly complicated rituals. Every Roman knew the feeling of spiritual burnout long before anyone had the language for it. And yet stopping wasn't an option. Maintaining divine favour was like carrying a heavy amphora. If you put it down, it shattered, and shards were dangerous. A lapse in vigilance wasn't simply a personal failure. It threatened family, city, and fate. The weight of responsibility pressed on everyone's shoulders, and no one could shrug it off without consequence. Even rest wasn't restful. Sleep meant dreams. Dreams meant messages. Messages meant interpretation. Privacy didn't exist, not from the gods, not from the community, not from your own conscience. Imagine trying to relax in a world where a cough might indicate you angered someone divine. A crooked wreath on a household shrine might cause household anxiety. A moment of forgetfulness might ripple into disaster. A cheerful day with no omens might be misread as ominous silence. The emotional baseline wasn't peace. It was fatigue sharpened by caution. Some Romans coped by becoming hyper-religious, performing every ritual with obsessive detail, hoping that perfection could buy peace. Others coped by performing rituals mechanically, barely engaging except out of fear. A few simply hoped no god noticed them too closely, performing only what they had to and praying carefully that mediocrity counted as piety. But no one escaped the weight entirely. Even the wealthiest Romans weren't spared. They had larger estates, more shrines to manage, more land spirits to appease, more festivals to host, more rituals to fund. The poor had fewer obligations but less margin for error. One misfortune could destroy them. Rome admired discipline, but its religious system demanded something harsher: endurance. The long-term effect was emotional erosion. The constant vigilance wore grooves into the mind. A Roman learned to live in a perpetual state of readiness, as if the gods were always just about to say something, do something, or punish something. There was no spiritual relaxation, only temporary lulls between tasks. And because rituals never ended, neither did worry. In modern terms, Romans lived with the ancient equivalent of permanent spiritual burnout. They didn't have words like stress, anxiety, or emotional fatigue. Instead, they spoke of gravitas, the heaviness of life, and religio, the binding force of obligation. They understood the weight. Even if they couldn't articulate it the way we would today, the gods didn't comfort Romans. They expected from them. Faith wasn't uplifting, faith was maintenance, and in a world where the smallest slip could feel like the start of catastrophe. The ordinary Roman learned the hardest truth of all. Living correctly wasn't virtuous. It was exhausting. To understand ordinary Roman life, you must understand this. The fear wasn't a flaw in the system. The fear was the system. Roman religion wasn't designed to soothe people or offer comforting visions of the afterlife. It wasn't built to provide spiritual peace. It wasn't even structured to reward virtue. Roman religion existed primarily to control behavior, reinforce hierarchy, and maintain order, not through love, but through persistent, carefully cultivated anxiety. Modern societies use laws, courts, and police to enforce order. Rome used those too, but underlying and supporting all of that was something much more effective: a pervasive belief that misbehavior, negligence, and irreverence would bring divine retaliation not only upon the offender but upon everyone nearby. Romans didn't obey rules because they were logical. They obeyed because disobedience felt like lighting a small fire and praying the wind didn't blow. Fear created social discipline long before soldiers or magistrates stepped in. From childhood onward, Romans learned that the gods judged everything: words, gestures, rituals, silence, timing, attitudes, omissions, and even forgetfulness. Fear shaped habits. Habits shaped obedience. And obedience created the very structure Rome prided itself on. The fear wasn't chaotic or unpredictable. It was a tool, sharp, reliable, and handled expertly by the state. Government officials, priests, senators, and generals all benefited from a population convinced that their personal mistakes could unleash disaster. When people fear divine punishment, they police themselves. They correct each other. They reinforce norms without being told to. They behave not because someone is watching, but because someone divine is watching. That kind of supervision doesn't require patrols or surveillance. It requires belief. Even the emperors understood this. Augustus, Rome's great political architect, revived old rituals, rebuilt temples, and emphasized religious observance because he recognized that a fearful population is a controllable one. Stability flowed from piety, and piety flowed from fear. A city terrified of offending the gods was a city unlikely to rebel, unlikely to experiment with new ideas, unlikely to challenge authority. Fear was the quiet backbone of order. Consider how this religious fear operated socially. 1. It unified communities through shared anxiety. If everyone is worried about performing rituals correctly, everyone cooperates. Festivals, sacrifices, and ceremonies became tools for binding the population together, not through joy, but through synchronized caution. 2. It protected the hierarchy. Rituals required priests, priests required political endorsement, and political leaders claimed divine approval to justify their authority. If the gods favoured the ruling class, opposing them wasn't just treason, it was impiety. 3. It discouraged dissent. Religious deviation wasn't quirky or philosophical, it was dangerous. If you abandoned traditional rituals, you risked bringing divine wrath upon your neighbourhood. People didn't tolerate innovation. Fear enforced conformity better than any senator could. 4. It made individuals responsible for collective fate. One ritual mistake, one forgotten offering, one careless act could doom a village. This created a culture where everyone monitored everyone else's behaviour. People watched their neighbours with the same suspicion they held for themselves. Fear became the glue that held Rome together. This wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. To govern a diverse, sprawling empire with countless languages, cultures and customs, Rome needed a universal emotional language. Fear worked where unity failed. Poverty, wealth, gender, occupation, none of that mattered. Everyone feared the gods. Everyone feared offending them. Everyone feared the consequences. Fear equalized. Even in political life, divine anger was a powerful rhetorical tool. A failing crop? Blame impiety. A plague? Blame ritual neglect. A military defeat? Blame a commander who mocked sacred chickens. Politicians weaponized fear the way modern politicians weaponize rhetoric. To mobilize, to justify, to accuse, and to reinforce their own authority. Religion wasn't just spiritual, it was political engineering. When Rome conquered new regions, they incorporated foreign gods not out of tolerance but out of caution. A god ignored was a god who might get angry. Better to fold them into the system and expand the web of fear than risk leaving a dangerous divine wildcard loose in the empire. Polytheism wasn't generosity, it was risk management. But fear didn't just operate on the public level. It seeped into the private mind. A mother checking the hearth flame, terrified of the flicker might mean a ritual was incomplete. A farmer lying awake at night, wondering if his poor harvest reflected divine disappointment. A craftsman repeating a prayer to ensure a single mispronounced syllable wouldn't bring financial ruin. A soldier gripping his amulet before battle, not afraid of death, but afraid of divine rejection. Fear shaped thought. Thought shaped behaviour. Behaviour shaped Rome. And here lies the strangest irony. Roman religion kept people in line, but it also kept Rome alive. The fear that bound them also stabilised them. The caution that exhausted them also unified them. The anxiety that drained them also structured a functioning society. Romans didn't like fear, but they respected it. They used it. They nourished it. It was the one thing the gods and the government agreed on. In the end, Rome didn't stand because of armies, marble, or political genius alone. It stood because its people were afraid. Afraid of doing things wrong, afraid of angering unseen powers, afraid of being the one whose negligence tipped the balance. Fear didn't weaken Rome. Fear kept Rome standing. Looking back across 2,000 years of Roman life, from the smoke-filled temples to the anxious hearths, from the battlefield omens to the household whispers, it becomes clear that the Romans weren't irrational, superstitious, or overly dramatic. Their world made sense to them. They lived in a universe where divine attention shaped everything from weather patterns to political fortunes. In that context, fear wasn't a flaw, it was a survival strategy. The good news was simple. The gods protected Rome. They kept the city standing, blessed the fields, guarded families, guided armies, and watched over ceremonies. Romans believed that divine order underpinned everything, from the position of the stars to the success of the harvest. Life wasn't random, it was supervised. The bad news, they never stopped checking. For the Romans, the idea of a silent heaven would have been terrifying. A god who left you alone was a god who no longer cared whether you prospered or collapsed. Constant monitoring, constant judgment, and constant ritual weren't burdens. They were proof that the gods were still engaged. And if you lived in a world where cosmic disasters were real, where plagues arrived without explanation, and where empires rose and fell with bewildering speed, divine attention, even the stern kind, was comforting in its own severe way. The Romans lived with fears we no longer face, fears of ritual precision, divine surveillance, mistaken offerings, offended deities, and supernatural messages hidden inside everyday objects. But these fears weren't signs of weakness or ignorance. They formed a logical system for interpreting a world full of uncertainty. If you lacked scientific explanations for earthquakes, illness, and famine, divine causation felt not only reasonable but reassuringly structured. Fear gave shape to chaos. Modern people have data, models, weather forecasts, germ theory, statistics. Romans had none of those tools. What they did have was a worldview that transformed randomness into responsibility. When something terrible happened, it wasn't meaningless. It was a signal, a reprimand, a chance to correct the cosmic balance. The universe wasn't cold or indifferent. It cared enough to scold. In a strange way, this made Roman religion emotionally functional. You didn't have to surrender to uncertainty. You simply had to perform and keep performing to retain divine approval. But the emotional cost was enormous. Constant vigilance, relentless obligations, and the exhausting sense that every action carried metaphysical consequences created a society always tight with tension. Yet Romans rarely questioned it. Religious fear was stitched so deeply into daily life that removing it would have been like pulling threads out of a tapestry until the whole fabric collapsed. And that's the deeper truth. Rome's fear-based religious system worked because it was woven into everything. Law, magistrates sought divine approval before acting. Politics, leaders claimed divine favour as evidence of legitimacy. Family life, hearth rituals shaped household identity. Economics, merchants sought divine luck in business. Agriculture, farmers viewed weather as divine feedback. Military, generals obeyed omens as strictly as military orders. Fear wasn't an accessory to Roman life, it was its anchor. But from a modern perspective, the strangest contrast emerges here. We see fear as oppressive. Romans saw fear as orderly. Without it, they believed the world would unravel. Crops failing, armies losing, diseases spreading, families collapsing. Fear wasn't something to escape, it was something to maintain. Because fear kept every citizen, from slave to emperor, in line with the cosmos. And when you step back from the rituals, omens, sacrifices, and divine mood swings, you discover an elegant logic. If everything is dangerous, then everything is meaningful. Meaning is powerful, meaning sustains societies. The Romans built one of the most influential civilizations in human history. Bridges, laws, roads, languages, philosophies. And they built it while believing the sky was constantly auditing them. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Was it effective? Undeniably. Was it logical? In their world, perfectly. So the good news? The gods protected Rome. They watched over crops, hearths, armies, and families. Their scrutiny created unity, purpose, and structure in a chaotic world. The bad news? They never stopped checking, and that pressure shaped every breath an ordinary Roman took. And perhaps the most surprising thing is this. Romans didn't want the gods to stop watching. A silent world felt more terrifying than a strict one. Better a universe full of judgment than a universe with none at all. Fear kept Rome standing. Fear kept Rome together. And fear, for all its weight, gave Romans something we still search for today. A reason, a pattern, a story that made sense of the dark.